On this episode of What's Going On with Shipping, is the United States out of fuel in the Pacific? Hi, I'm your host, Sal Mercogliano. So, week before last, I was up in New York City for the Navy League's Maritime Security Conference on a panel discussing the closing of the Red Hill Fuel Facility in Hawaii. Now, this is the facility that was built in 1943 to provide the logistics needed for the Central Pacific Drive across to defeat Japan in World War II. And it was really highlighted because of the potential attack against Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, that could have resulted in the destruction of the above-ground fuel tanks. So these fuel tanks have been in the ground since 1943, and unfortunately what we've seen happen is fuel has leaked from this facility into the groundwater, precipitating the decision finally, after friggin' way too long, in my opinion, of a time, to close it, ironically, on December 7th, 2022, a weird coincidence. But the question is, does the U.S. now have sufficient fuel facilities to stage a conflict across the Pacific against, some unknown enemy, China, in the future? That's the question that we posed at the conference and talked about. Well, this week, the National Defense Transportation Association, in conjunction with the U.S. Transportation Command, are hosting their fall meeting in St. Louis, Missouri. Now, I'm not going to this meeting. I didn't get an invite. But one of the things that I think needs to be talked about is among a whole slew of topics. Now, I can give you a whole slew of topics that I think need to be talked about at this conference, not the least of which is recapitalization of the surge sea lift fleet, the construction of new sea lift vessels, the rebuilding of the U.S. commercial merchant marine. And, oh, by the way, you're in St. Louis, Missouri. Go out, walk to the river, and look at how low the river is, and look at the chaos it's having on our inland transportation system, because supply chain should be talked about the whole time. Anyway, I could come up with 50 topics to talk about at this conference. But the topic I want to talk about here is Red Hill and fuel, and why this should be of paramount importance in this upcoming conference. So before we delve into this, take a moment, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell so you'll be alerted about new videos as they come in. All right, let's jump into this. So this conference has a veritable who's who in defense transportation. Obviously, the commander of TRANSCOM herself, General Jacqueline von Ost, is going to be there, along with Admiral Chris Grady, who is the head of J4 at the Joint Staff in charge of logistics. A whole batch of other people here with moderators and panels. And if you look at really the agenda here, it is a impressive long conference. I'm not going to lie. I would love to go to one of these conferences and just be a fly on the wall and listen to it. Obviously, a whole series of working groups they have, including what they call the Transportation Academy, is hosted here. They have, obviously, forums and roundtable discussions that discuss this. I'll have the link in the show notes so you can take a look at it. Some of these are actually broadcast, so you can actually catch some of them on the live stream. Unfortunately, I don't think all of them are, which is a big, huge detriment, I think, in many ways. But there are a lot of great events that are hosted here. One of the interesting things that I did was look at this. This is the, again, there's a little bit of a discussion here where they talk about what they're going to do in their Transportation Academy. So this is their Transportation Academy. And again, this is an interesting little area they have where people who are involved in transportation, defense transportation, can go and sit in these seminars, and quite a few across the board. But just to give you an idea here, type in sea lift. There are about 4 panels I found here on Sea Lift, including one being done by Admiral Mike Wetlaufer, the commander of Military Sea Lift Command, where he's going to talk about maritime industrial base, can it support our needs? One here by Marad talking about Sea Lift recapitalization. You can guess which 2 I'd want to be at right there. But the one I really was interested in this was, again, I want to talk about Red Hill. And so, type in Red Hill here, no response found. Let's type in fuel. And we got one panel here, transforming fuel and fleet management. Again, I think this topic is absolutely essential to talk about. You're losing the main fuel hub for the United States military in the Central Pacific because of the closing of Red Hill. So let's go ahead and take a look at this in a little bit more detail and give you my historical analogies to this situation if I was presenting at NDTA. So this is the statement done by Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin back in March. announcing the closure of the Red Hill facility. He goes on here, and the point I want to make here is at the very last paragraph that's showing here right now. Centrally located bulk fuel storage of this magnitude likely made sense in 1943 when Red Hill was built. And Red Hill has served our armed forces well for many decades. But it makes a lot less sense now. The distributed and dynamic nature of our force posture in the Indo-Pacific, the sophisticated threats we face, and the technology available to us demand an equally advanced and resilient fueling capability. To a large degree, we already avail ourselves of dispersed fueling at sea and ashore, permanent and rotational. We will now expand and accelerate that strategic distribution. Holy crap, that's a word salad of Department of Defense buzzwords right there. Distributed, logistics, resilient. Oh my God. I mean, can I be clear? Every public affairs officer in the military has a thesaurus of words they have to use. And I think whoever wrote that for the Secretary of Defense used almost all of them. If you're playing public affairs bingo, I think you pretty much scored well on that card. My question is, okay, what Whiskey Tango Foxtrot, what does that all mean? And can we actually support the military with our distributed fuel by losing Red Hill? Because we got to put Red Hill into some context. What exactly does Red Hill mean in its closure? So let's go ahead and talk about that. So Red Hill consists of 20 underground tanks. Each of these tanks are capable of housing 12.5 million gallons of fuel. That's a total of 250 million gallons of fuel. That's equal to about 6 million barrels of fuel. 1 barrel equals 42 gallons. So this is a tremendous facility. I mean, again, 250 million gallons of fuel is quite impressive. And it really came out of the attack on December 7th, 1941, the need not just for additional fuel storage, but to get that fuel storage below ground and ensure its safety. Again, if you go back to December 7th, 1941, the U.S. Pacific Fleet had forward deployed to Pearl Harbor. It was a big controversial issue when it was done in 1939. At the start of World War II, the U.S. Pacific Fleet was based at the west coast of the United States, basically in San Diego, and that's where it was based. But with the expansion of the war and to deter the Japanese, the decision was made to base the Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, and to support that, a large infrastructure program was undertaken, including the creation of large oil storage facilities to fuel the fleet. So this map shows you the creation and distribution of the oil facilities at Pearl Harbor. So if you look at this map here, the main channel into Pearl Harbor, this is the main channel leading into Pearl Harbor right here. This is how you would sail into Pearl Harbor this way. This takes you out to sea. The lower tank farm was right here on the main channel coming in. And this lower tank farm had roughly 50,000 barrels of fuel in about 19 tanks. So 50,000 barrels of fuel, that's about the size of a small tanker in World War II, a pretty small size. This was the initial tank farm that was created. And then there were other tank farms that created. There was the middle tank farm up here. This was a series of 10 tanks, each about 50,000 barrels each. But the main one was here, the upper tank farm. This is the tank farm right here that was up on the hill above the main base headquarters here. 17 tanks. Each of these tanks could hold 150,000 barrels of fuel. And understand, 150,000 barrels of fuel, that was basically the size of the largest oiler tanker in the U.S. fleet at the time. And 17 of these tanks were in position here. So all told, the United States could hold roughly about 172 million gallons of fuel across Pearl Harbor, or about a little over 4 million barrels. So a substantial amount of fuel capacity was at Pearl Harbor in 1941, but it was all above ground. It was all above ground. And if you look at the attack on Pearl Harbor when it was staged, right here, this is Battleship Row. This is where the main battleships were at. And when the attack was staged, the torpedo planes came here this way through this channel, basically lining up to attack along this way. And then the high altitude bombers to attack the inboard battleships flew in from this direction. And the first two waves of the Japanese attack were focused on the vessels in Pearl Harbor, the airfields, and the main installations. What they never hit was the fuel depots shown there. And then, of course, right here in the center is the Navy Yard with the dry docks and the repair facilities. Now, these facilities were quite prominent in Pearl Harbor. This is an image of those upper tanks. You can see the size of these upper tanks. As a matter of fact, if you look up here along the water, you can see submarines and actually a sub-tender all right here. It gives you kind of an image here for the size of vessels. And again, each of these individual tanks here, and again, there are 17 of them here, can holds about the capacity of one Navy oiler, which is quite impressive. Also note that there was a lot of defenses put into this. You'll notice here that these tanks are not out in the open just with no protection. There are these large revetments that are built around the tanks, and this is designed, should the tanks be ruptured, to capture the oil and prevent it from spilling. And again, that was a big concern, that the tanks could leak and these revetments would catch them, or in case of an attack, you could hit them, the oil can leak out, it could catch fire, but it would be contained in these areas. So a lot of thought went in to the oil protection here. Even though you have this big, huge tank farm up here on the hill above SINCPAC headquarters in the submarine base, you still had dispersed fuel at the middle tank farm and the smaller tank farm. The attack on Pearl Harbor catches two U.S. Navy oilers in the harbor. One is up at the Navy base, the Ramapo, which is a smaller oiler. She was preparing to go to the Philippines to replenish stocks in the Philippines. She was actually loading U.S. Navy PT boats for John Buckley's squadron out in the Philippines. The other half of that squadron was heading out on the deck of the Ramapo. That squadron had been delivered earlier in 1941 on the deck of the USS Guadalupe. Here you see the battleship California listing. She's at the very western edge of Battleship Row. She's taken 2 torpedoes and is listing. But right behind her is the oiler Neosho. And Neosho is an important part here in the story. She is one of 12 Cimarron class T3 tankers built under the Merchant Marine Act of 1936. This tanker was part of a program to get oilers into the commercial fleet, tankers into the commercial fleet, but with the ability to take them over by the Navy and bring them into naval service. These tankers were built with national defense features. So instead of having single screws, one propeller, they had twin propellers. They had much bigger engines than were needed to propel them not at 14 or 15 knots, but propel them up to 18 knots. They also had provisions in there for armament, for additional crew members, and for underway replenishment rigs, although Neosho at this time had not been fitted with them. She was just doing replenishment runs from the West Coast to the Pearl Harbor. Matter of fact, she was docked at Ford Island, topping off the gasoline, the aviation gasoline tanks at Ford Island that morning. She was fully loaded. You can notice she's down to her draft marks. She's fully loaded with oil, and she will back out of Battleship Row during the midst of the attack and head over to the submarine base to dock. But again, ships like Neosho and her 11 sister ships were really crucial early in the war to not just sustain the U.S. fast carrier task forces, but to shuttle fuel from the West Coast to Pearl Harbor to replenish those oil tanks. It sounds like there's a lot of oil at Pearl Harbor, but understand, a battleship like the California could hold 30,000 barrels of fuel. So one of those big tanks could only replenish 5 battleships. The U.S. had 9 battleships assigned to the Pacific Fleet. 8 were at Pearl Harbor on December 7th. 1 was over at Bremerton for a shipyard repair. And 3 of the New Mexicos were over across in the Atlantic on detached duty. And so you needed a lot of fuel. I'll give you an idea. The Yorktown battle group, when the Fast Task Force is put together, Task Force 17, it consumes about 5,000 barrels of oil a day. The carrier, the cruisers, the destroyers, and more so when they're operating at full speed. And so you need a lot of fuel to be able to sustain this. One of the big questions, of course, with Pearl Harbor is what if the third wave had been launched and targeted these tanks? If you look at the planes that were used in the first wave of the Pearl Harbor attack, they were divided up into different areas. You had the Kates, which were these Nakajima type 97s. These were the torpedo bombers that went in that torpedoed Battleship Row, but they were also the high altitude bombers. And these were high altitude bombers that carried large armor piercing bombs that were used to hit the inboard battleships. They flew in flights of 5, so there were 10 flights of 5 aircraft, although one aborted, so there was only 49. And they achieved about a 10 to 15% hit rate in their bombing attacks. You also have the Val dive bombers. The Val dive bombers, which were launched for the attack, were able to dive bomb down. They could have been outfitted, refitted with high explosive bombs and sent out to hit these oil tanks, and it would have been pretty disastrous had they done them. I'm not saying they would have destroyed all of them. I don't think that was actually possible for them to do it. One of the problems you would have is as soon as you hit one of these oil tanks, and if it should catch on fire, the smoke would cloud up and basically obstruct your ability to see other ones. But I think if they had equipped the Kates for high altitude bombing, or even equipped them as they did the Kates in the second wave with medium and small scale bombs and dropped them in the area of the oil tanks, it could have caused a lot of damage and a lot of concern. I don't think you see all the oil tanks go out of service, but I do think you see a massive disruption at the time. But again, in many ways, the Japanese didn't have to do this, because in truth, the Americans were always hindered by a shortage of oil in the execution of the Pacific War. It's one of the reasons why Admiral Nimitz has to decide to keep his battleships, once reconstituted, on the West Coast. He does not have enough fuel to sustain them, let alone if the fuel farm had been destroyed. If you look at early on December 7th, 1941, the Americans only have a handful of tankers that are available to sustain the Pacific Fleet. They've got 2 out in the Philippines. There are 2 at Pearl Harbor. There's one heading to Pearl Harbor, the Neches, which is on the way. There's one up in Alaska, but the bulk of them are on the West Coast, which are loading up with oil and making shuttle runs to keep the tanks replenished at Pearl Harbor. Because again, as the battleships, as the fast carrier task forces head to sea, like Enterprise, which had just dropped off a flight of Wildcat fighters for Wake Island, or the Lexington, which was heading out with a squadron of dive bombers for Midway, there was a lot of consumption of oil at this time and fuel. And one of the things we do see are the tankers are heavily hit early in World War II. 4 of them will eventually be sunk. The Neches supporting supporting Lexington in a strike against Wake Island. The Pecos out in the Far East, out in the Dutch East Indies. The Neosho will be sunk down at Coral Sea, and the Kanawha later off Guadalcanal. And so the Americans face a real difficulty here that they do not have enough oilers to sustain the fleet. And that's why early in World War II, Admiral Nimitz has to request for 20 commercial tankers to come from the U.S. Merchant Marine to support his Pacific Fleet, because even with the oilers he has on hand, he doesn't have enough. And as the Americans undertake offensive operations with Pacific raids and strikes, and then eventually offensive operations against Guadalcanal, he even needs more tankers. Matter of fact, by September of 1942, he's requesting that commercial tankers be fitted with the capability to underway replenish, to receive replenishment rigs from Navy oilers so that they can top off Navy oilers at sea. This is the genesis for the service squadrons later in the war, keeping the U.S. carriers at sea almost perpetually late into 1944 and into 1945. Now, the Pacific War is just one example of an extended reach where you need logistics. 1941, 42, early World War II, 80 years ago, we see that example. But we have another example of that just 40 years ago this year, and that is the Falkland campaign of 1982. Take the Pacific map, put it on its side, and you get the British sailing from Great Britain down to the Falkland Islands in the South Atlantic. And the British required a massive infusion of vessels to sustain their operations in the Falklands. They tapped into the Royal Fleet Auxiliary, much like the U.S. has the Military Sealift Command. The Royal Navy has the Royal Fleet Auxiliary with civilian merchant mariners crewing vessels that support their fleet. And right off the very beginning, the RFA, the Royal Fleet Auxiliary, is being used to maintain the Royal Navy's operations off the Falklands. You see, in fleet tankers, these are the tankers that are providing direct underway replenishment to the battle groups. They have a fleet of them. They have the OL classes, they have the Tides, they have the Blue Rover, and then they have a whole series of support tankers. These are tankers that will basically run back to get fuel and keep the oilers at sea, what are known as shuttle ships. The problem is the distances involved. The British do not have enough shuttle ships to keep the oilers supplied, and so they have to go to the commercial merchant marine in what is called stuffed, ships taken up from trade. And the stuff fleet is brought in with their commercial crews, and you'll see they bring in transports, they bring in cargo ships, they bring in troop ships, but they also bring in oilers and tankers, and it is a large tanker fleet. That tanker fleet is absolutely critical to maintain the British support through the Atlantic. The British would tell you, read Admiral Sandy Woodward's biography, 100 Days. He talks about the crucial role that these ships play in maintaining the British task force. Fast forward to the modern day, and you look at dispositions across the Pacific. This is U.S. Navy oilers and U.S. commercial tankers under lease to MSC and their positions. This is all open source. I'm not giving away any military secrets here. I pulled this off Marine Traffic. But one of the things you see here are 3 Henry J. Kaiser class oilers on the west coast of the United States. 1 is in a shipyard. 2 are on the west coast. You have a AOE, one of the supply class oilers that's up in Bremerton right now. And then over in Japan, 2 Kaiser class oilers, another Kaiser class oiler in the Philippines, and 1 in Singapore. Add to it 3 commercial tankers that are under lease to the Military Sealift Command. 1 is transporting fuel between Japan and Guam. Another one is off Hawaii, and the other one is on the west coast. And again, very similar, I would argue, to the disposition we saw of U.S. oilers on the eve of World War II. Very similar. Except what's missing now is that massive fuel farm that existed in the Central Pacific in Hawaii with the closing of Red Hill. Once you close that Red Hill facility, now you're talking about bringing a lot of oil, a lot of fuel from the west coast of the United States to the Western Pacific. Add to this, the U.S. lacks a commercial merchant marine, much like it had prior to World War II. At the start of World War II, the United States had 440 tankers with the capability of over 5.1 million deadweight tons of oil. Today, we have roughly about 65 tankers with a capacity of 4.1 million deadweight tons. And all of this really poses the question, can the United States sustain itself across the Pacific? Those ships forward deployed in the Philippines, at Singapore, and Japan. Remember, U.S. MSC oilers have no armament on board at all. RFA oilers do. They have Royal Navy Armed Guards on board. They have point defense. These vessels don't. They have no armament on board. And so they're completely susceptible to attacks. Now, Kaiser class oilers and the new John Lewis class, and John Lewis was just taken in service at NASCO recently. I don't have her on here because she's still undergoing tests and evaluations, but they have provisions to mount 2 Sea Whizzes, 2 close-in weapon systems, but they're not mounted, and they lack really the provisions to have them put on at a very quick time. As far as I know, a Kaiser class oiler was never fitted with a Sea Whiz, even in a test evaluation. So this is a big problem. And again, logistics is a big target in time of war. We already saw how fast the U.S. lost oilers in the beginning of World War II. Those 4 oilers that were lost were early in World War II, all of them before 1943. And now the U.S. faces a similar situation. And so that brings us really to the key point here. What happens with the closure of Red Hill? Yes, we've got the ability here to bring in some, commercial vessels that can be used if we need them. There's an example that the MSC has been doing of consolidation operation, using some of those civilian tankers to replenish their underway tankers. That's great. But we only have a handful of them. As I mentioned before, 3 in the Pacific. At the end of World War II, when we created the Military Sea Transportation Service, which was the precursor of MSC, we had 55 T2 tankers that were brought in. At the start of the Persian Gulf War of 1990, the United States had 25 commercial tankers under lease. Now, again, we have under 5 commercial tankers under lease. And we're putting a huge burden on the fleet oilers to provide the role of not just underway replenishment and sustaining the forward fleet, but for running back to the fuel farms and get fuel and carry them across. And without Red Hill in the mid-Pacific, you're talking about having to send ships potentially all the way back to the west coast of the United States if fuel facilities are shut off to the United States, either through OPEC shutting them down, the Mideast shutting them down, or because of the loss of ability to get there because of maritime choke points. All of that plays a huge, important role and raises the question of how many John Lewis class oilers do we need? And do we need not just John Lewis class oilers, but do we need commercial tankers to support them? An eco class tanker, as you see here, that's refueling alongside a Kaiser class oiler, can carry twice the fuel that a Kaiser or a Lewis class. Kaiser, the latest generation of Kaisers with the double hulls and the Lewis class coming online now can carry about 150,000 barrels of fuel. That's almost the same amount of fuel the Cimarrons could carry in World War II. Their speed is almost identical. The Kaisers go and Lewis's go about 20 knots. The Cimarrons about 18 knots. Cimarrons and Lewis's can carry some dry goods, which the Cimarrons couldn't. But the Cimarrons were also armed. 4 5-inch 38 calibers, 40 millimeter Bofors, 20 millimeter Oerlikons. A lot of defense was put onto those vessels, and they were Navy crewed, not civilian crewed. And one of the things that we've done is really blur the line between Navy oilers and commercial tankers. And so this issue should be centerpiece at NDTA this week coming up, and I hope it is, because we really need to come up with resolutions to this issue, because again, without it, we face a critical fuel shortfall across the Pacific. I hope you enjoyed today's video. If you did, take a moment, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell so you'll be alerted about new videos as they come out. Leave a comment, share it across social media, and if you can, contribute to the page. How do you do that? You can hit the super thanks button below where you can contribute directly to the page, or head on over to Patreon. You'll see a link come up at the end of the video or down in the show notes. You can go ahead and become a monthly or yearly subscriber to the channel. As a patron, you help keep this channel going. Until the next video, this is Sal, signing off.